Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted. This is where religion, culture, and politics intersect in real time. I'm one of your hosts, Jamar Tisby, joined by Diana Butler Bass.
Hey, Jamar, and I'm joining from a hotel room in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Thank you. That was going to be my next question. Where in the world is Diana Butler Bass? Like where's Waldo? And Robbie Jones.
Hi there. I'm at home, as you can see, but happy to be here.
Same with me. And Kristen Dumais is normally here, but she is out of town at the moment. We will miss her presence and her commentary. But we are scholars, historians, and sociologists who explore how religion shapes America's past and present. But the kicker is we're responding in real time to the events of the day. So there's no prep, no scripts, just our raw, unfiltered conversation. And that's why we call it the Convocation Unscripted. This episode is officially in session. Y'all, we have a lot going on in the news, which is typical, but I feel like there's even more, and a lot of it is even more consequential than in perhaps a typical week or day at this point. But before we dive into that, do you see anything that lifts your spirits a little bit? Anything that on the landscape or the horizon that may feel a bit positive to you?
I'll jump in. Anytime I think we see people standing up for the freedom of institutions, the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, I am thrilled to see it. We've seen way too many people bending the knee, making the compromise, but we just had a number of universities stand up and say, nope, they were offered, the Trump administration tried to offer them this deal where if they would basically comply and agree to be monitored and give up all kinds of independence, they could get preferential treatment in government funding. And so that's where this is headed. People may not know that's happening, but the Trump administration is trying this kind of carrot strategy now with universities, trying to get them to comply with all kinds of anti-DEI things, and also give up a lot of independence of their faculty, what faculty are teaching, books will and will not appear on syllabi, like what their admissions policies look like, all of that. But we had nine, MIT plus eight, so nine schools that all stood together and said, actually, no. So I'm just going to read them out because I want to give them all the shout out here. So MIT, Vanderbilt, the University of Pennsylvania, Dartmouth College, the University of Southern California, the University of Texas at Austin, the University of Arizona, Brown University, and the University of Virginia. So as you hear that list, you'll notice there's private and public institutions, right, that are kind of being hit in this way. But they basically all stood up and just said, yeah, no, like this. These are principles with which we disagree, and they spelled it out in letters back to the administration. They didn't just kind of quietly say no, but they loudly said no, and just said, like, for example, they said, fundamentally, the premise of the document, the government's document, is inconsistent with our core belief that scientific funding should be based on scientific merit alone. In other words, not by currying favor with the administration, and stood up for freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and their own independence as an institution. So I'm, for one, any victory like this, and particularly one that is about solidarity and institutions standing. And remember, these institutions are competitors, right? I mean, they're all competing for students. So there is a kind of perverse incentive for many of these institutions to throw each other under the bus. But nonetheless, they're and to get the competitive advantage. But they all instead said, nope, we're actually going to stand together here against this, certainly coercive and manipulative way of kind of trying to get them to give up their independence.
That is good. Diana, had you paid attention to that one, or was there any other news that you were like, well, I'm pleasantly surprised?
Well, there has been, I think, good news out of the protest fronts. We'll talk, I know, a little bit more about No Kings at the end, but it's been really fun to watch those protests in Portland. I mean, unicorns dancing, the frog man is now famous, the chicken suit people, the folks on, bicycles and unicycles going by. And so while there has been the really violent parts that have been mostly directed against nonviolent protesters, like the Presbyterian minister who got shot with the pepper balls, a lot of it has been really well, I think, executed by the protesters to keep the environment from straying into provoking the government into negative actions. And so I think that's really good news. I've been looking at this, looking for, and I'm trying to figure out exactly where it is. The Lutheran bishops came out with a new letter about Christian nationalism. They also have a new head of their communion. The Lutherans elected an African American bishop, black bishop, for the first time to be the head of the ELCA, big, more liberal Lutheran denomination. And they seem to be finding their feet under them,
Mm.
to be protesting more vigorously and theologically, which is, of course, the Lutherans' real strong suit, against Christian nationalism. And that means that a number of denominations now have come out with formal statements from their highest ruling bodies saying that Christian nationalism is a heresy. And
Mm.
we have to be able to cheer that. And I'm looking forward to a couple more of those denominations coming up to the plate and doing the same. And I think it's just really fantastic for the ones who have led the way, either in bringing suits against the Trump administration to stop particular policies, mostly around immigration, or to take on the theological abuse of their traditions, and to encourage. And when the bishops do that, or a national organization does that, then that encourages all the clergy all the way down in deeper in the structures, to be braver about addressing their congregations and making these issues front and center in local churches. So it's a real way to back clergy who want to be able to take part in protests and also address some of the real theological and spiritual issues that are caught up in this political moment. I think that's a great thing too.
Absolutely. And on my part, historian, so I'm always scanning the landscape for positive developments in history. And one of them is more popular culture oriented. I just had the opportunity to interview Clint Smith, who's a writer for The
Wow.
Atlantic. And it
Yeah.
was about this. This is a special issue of The Atlantic called The Unfinished Revolution. Really gorgeous panels and paintings and all this stuff here. But it's sort of it comes in the context of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which is, of course, happening next year, 2026. And it is very troublesome, very concerning that this anniversary, which calls for accurate historical truth telling, is coming under this
Mm.
regime that has been adamantly opposed to a full, robust accounting of history in any ways that they deem look unpatriotic. So they keep saying they want a patriotic education or patriotic history, which means tell all the shiny, happy parts and downplay or erase anything that makes the United States look bad. So in the midst of all of that, the Atlantic kind of wants to get ahead of the curve there. And before 2026, they have this offering called the Unfinished Revolution, talking about the founding of the nation. And so it's sort of similar in composition to the 1619 project, at least in my head. A variety of contributors, most of them historians, scholars, experts in some way, and they are all pontificating on different aspects of the founding. So with Clint Smith, he wrote an article about how real should the history at Colonial Williamsburg be, or does it need to be?
Mm.
And the idea was 31 years ago they had this reenactment of a slave auction that was incredibly realistic and therefore incredibly disturbing. They haven't done it since, and it got these mixed reactions. Some thought it was very honest and necessarily shocking history. Other people, including Black people, protested it and just use that as a kernel to talk more broadly about the telling and retelling of history at a place like Williamsburg. So I'm glad that we have this offering. I'm glad that we have narratives and stories to push back against the propagandized versions of history that are going to come on even stronger as we approach July 4th, 2026 and beyond. So that was one thing that I was looking at as, all right, well, at least we got something we can argue about.
Yeah, I think a lot of people right now are like, okay, this is it. We're going to use our voices. We're going to use our platforms. We're tired of being scared. I think that is one of the
Mm,
main feelings I'm kind of running into right now is instead of people just being frozen in fear, it's like they are beginning to move off of that and say, no, I'm not going to live this way. I have a voice, I have a vote. I'm going to use both of those things as long as I can. And so um, I think that there's a little bit of a turn in the grassroots about that. And maybe they're seeing institutions like the educational institutions or a major magazine like The Atlantic, or they're seeing the Lutheran bishops stand up. And that makes even a few institutions do that, it gives so much courage to regular folks so they feel less alone.
Yep. I'm going to add one more before we leave this topic. Don't I
three's our
don't really
limit
want to
for
be accused
positive.
of having too much good news. That's never really
Right.
my role. But since Kristen's not here, maybe we just do the whole thing on good news.
Oh, very good.
One joke at Kristen's expense while she's not here to defend herself. But I will throw out one more that did again give me, a little uplift, and that is that Pete Hegseth, the head of the Department of Defense. I refuse to call it Department of War. It is still the
Thank
Department of
you.
Defense, no matter how much Pete Hegseth wants to call it the Department of War. He does not have the authority to change that name himself. So he is head of the Department of Defense, and he tried to sort of make all of the press pool that covers the DoD sign a thing saying they would not publish anything that had not been pre-approved. So in other words, they're going to like pre-submit their stories to the DoD Communications Department to proofread and say, oh yeah, you can or you cannot say that before they go to press, even if it's unclassified information, right? And thankfully, again, all of the press pool turned in their badges and
Mm,
said, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. And that includes, by the way, Pete Hegseth's former employer, Fox News. Now that one I was not prepared for. I would not have. I would have had to take a drink if we were playing a drinking game on that one. But Fox joined the other four major broadcast networks, and they said this. I'm going to read the statement here. It's short, but it's heartening. It says, today, we join virtually every other news organization in declining to agree to the Pentagon's new requirements, which would restrict journalists' ability to keep the nation and the world informed of important national security issues. The policy is without precedent and threatens core journalistic protections. We will continue to cover the U.S. military as each of our organizations has done for many decades, upholding the principles of a free and independent press. So, bravo. Hats off.
Oh, there were two other pieces. So when Kristen isn't here, we really do go after the good news. I was really impressed by the announcement of the Nobel Peace Prize. And they had just a really quite stirring justification about their choice, about how they sit in a room surrounded by the portraits of all the Nobel laureates, and they want to honor the integrity of those past winners. And then, of course, I'm thinking through all the amazing people who've won the Nobel Peace Prize since its inception, and many people who are personal heroes of mine as a historian. And then they also took on a real stirring defense of democracy. And so I thought that was great to see them just stand up and say, we're not going to be lobbied, we're not going to be pushed around, you can't do this. We have these values and they are rock solid. And whatever you're going to do from there, we don't care. And so I thought that was great. And then the other thing is, I do think it is worth saying that the thing in Gaza could be potentially good news. But I feel like the three of us, I don't want to completely speak for all of us, but at least those of us who are here today, um, uh, we do want the war in Gaza to stop. We do want the violence in Gaza to stop. Anything that stops it, we're willing to say that's great. And I think we're also sort of holding back our enthusiasm a little because we're not entirely trustworthy of what has been decided is going to reach the ends of a genuine and just peace.
That's right. And on that note, there was so this is trivial compared to the actual matter, but there was a picture of Donald Trump on the cover of Time magazine referring to his quote unquote triumph to help broker a ceasefire in Gaza, and he hates the picture. He said social media, it may be the worst of all time. It's this picture taken from below, looking up at him. His hair is kind of wispy and not as bold and gold as it typically is. His skin is more blotched than it typically appears. You see his neck jowls. You also see the ear where when he was shot on stage, or with no apparent marks there. So that all is, people are talking all over social media about this coded kind of picture there. So again, just subversive. I think people, to your point, Diana, are finding some boldness. Courage begets courage, and some people are being more vocal and public about it. Some are being more subtle about it, but the resistance is there. And we need it because there are some really important things happening all around the country. And one of them is a severe attack on the Voting Rights Act. That's how I'll frame it. Um, What's going on is now that the Supreme Court is hearing a case regarding the Voting Rights Act. It's from Louisiana, and it's about a district that is designed and drawn to ensure that there is some representation of Black people in the House of Representatives from the state of Louisiana, which has a very large proportion of Black people. But we know the history here, where if we don't have these safeguards, if we don't have this protection, then it is very likely that the representation of any group of people of color, which statistically tend to vote democratically, although that's not destiny anymore, that could be wiped out. That could be wiped out completely. And so this is a key, this is a massive thing. I mean, the entire sort of thrust of the civil rights movement was desegregation, but the two-pronged goal was voting rights. And it culminated in the 1965 Voting Rights Act through much trial and tribulation. And now, after decades and decades, where this was largely celebrated as an advance of democracy and moving toward a more perfect union, that is now being challenged in a very serious way. And from the opening statements and the questions that the justices were asking, it looks like it's in a real precarious situation. So, Robbie, have you tuned into that at all, or what do you think are some of the implications here?
Well, it's about Louisiana, right? But it certainly made me think about my home state of Mississippi and just what I know about Mississippi. Just a couple of, things that have always stuck out to me about how egregious the efforts, judicial, extrajudicial, terrorist efforts with the KKK to prevent African Americans from voting in the South was, and how complete it was. For example, when my last book, I was writing about the Emmett Till case, and everybody knows it was an all white jury, right, that refused to convict his murderers. But what people don't realize is that there was no way there could be anything other than a white jury
Mm.
at the time, because there was not a single African American registered to vote in the entire county at the time, right? So that's how like complete, utterly complete, it was. There wasn't even anybody in the jury pool who was not white to be selected. And then just in my own hometown, like that's like so that's back in the 50s, but realizing that, so I grew up in Jackson. Jackson was about 40% black, about 60% white when I was growing up in the 80s. And it wasn't until 1985 that there was a single black representative on the Jackson City Council, because they
Mm.
had employed all kinds of crazy gerrymandering things, and then they had resorted to at-large election schemes to keep the kind of majority black districts from having a black representative, that kind of thing. And they did the same thing at the state level, right? So we had this, after Reconstruction, we had this election of black senators and black representatives from Mississippi that were quickly kind of clawed back with, what, let's remind ourselves what white Christians in the state called redemption, right? Using kind of our Christian, kind of distortions of our Christian theology about that. But we did not have another black representative from Reconstruction until I graduated high school in 1986, right? So I mean, it's that's the kind of history that we're talking about here. That's not that long ago, right? That we began to get any correctives, and we would not have gotten any of those correctives without the Voting Rights Act, and without those states being put under surveillance, because they had this history of violence. They had this history of unfair voting practices and intentional practices to keep black people from registering to vote, or if they were registered to vote, to keep them from actually voting. So this is not like made up history that's way back when. I mean, this is like our lifetimes.
Diana, this is going to be maybe a little bit sideways, but I'm not proposing that there's one single form of government that's quote unquote truly Christian, but I'm wondering from a faith perspective, or an ethical perspective, why we ought to be concerned about this rollback of the Voting Rights Act beyond, the representation, the actual representation in Congress. Why, from a faith standpoint, ought this to matter to us?
Well, it obviously matters on several fronts about the dignity and the worth of every human being. I mean, so theologically, it's very wrapped up in looking at humanity as everyone being fully human. And so if you don't go there, you're already missing a whole big part of the biblical story. And so theologically it makes a difference. I was really thinking about it a little bit, sort of sideways. You were asking me a sideways question. I was thinking about your sideways question sideways. Um, and that is how much the people around me when I was a little girl in the 1960s hated and feared the Civil Rights Acts, hated the
Mm.
Voting Rights Acts. And I can remember conversations, so I would have been very small, but I can remember sitting at tables with grown-ups saying, well, what's next? A black mayor in the city of Baltimore. And it was this fear of black overlords that was so terrifying to a lot of the white working class and white middle class people I grew up around, that it was part of the incentive to moving out into the counties.
Mm.
And even when I was in graduate school at Duke, there was still a huge rift and fight between Durham City and Durham County. And it was absolutely 100% around race, around whether or not black politicians would have anything to say over the lives of white people. And it was also related to how the schools would be funded and what the schools would teach. And so I just remember this absolute fear of black power that manifested itself in the lives of, you know, all the white people I knew who were,
Mhm.
and I was related to growing up. And that realization, I mean, it sort of stuck with me, my whole life is like, one, why are people so afraid? It seemed kind of crazy to me. But then I remember running it into it again in evangelical churches and
Mm,
how much the white evangelicals in my teenage years and college years hated the 1960s. And actually, a huge part of what they wanted to do was go back to the 1950s. And one of the reasons they wanted to go back to the 1950s was that the sphere of women and the sphere of potential power, particularly for Black men, was limited, um, or non-existent. And so for me, there is the theological piece about dignity and the worth of every human being, and how that is just a necessary component of what it means to be a Christian, is to hold those views. But then there's also this longer sort of political quest of taking away those rights which had been broadened in that particular decade. And anytime there's an attack on the civil rights of African Americans in this country, it is also a threat to all women in this country. So, of course, Black women are in a sort of double jeopardized stance there. But what happens with this in the Supreme Court? I'm looking at that as a white woman and saying, okay, well, this is the kind of step that becomes part of another desire in that community. And that would be to somehow limit or even take away women's rights to vote.
mm. You both bring up some powerful perspectives here. Diana, to your point, every if we all have equal dignity and worth, Genesis chapter 1, then we all have a voice, and that voice deserves to be heard. And in a democratic system, your vote is your voice. So
That's
to
right.
take away the opportunity to vote and to elect your representatives, people who are from your community, who understand your situation, is to take away your political voice in a sense. And then, Robbie, everything you're saying about Mississippi is spot on. I keep trying to tell people in my stumbling, fumbling way that if you want to know what's coming down the road, all you got to do is look at Mississippi past and present. And, to me, what this Voting Rights Act is about is a couple of things. One, you'll hear a lot of times people say we've only even had a semblance of a participatory democracy in this country for about 60 years, and they date it back to the Voting Rights Act, which finally opened up access for basically every group of people, more so than it was certainly during the Jim Crow era. The other thing that really is chilling to me about this is if they overturn this section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which, by the way, they've already overturned another section of the Voting Rights Act known as the pre-clearance section, that says places with a history of racial gerrymandering against Black people and other racial and ethnic minorities, they have to get pre-clearance before they make any major changes to make sure it's not discriminatory. That's already been overturned. So now they're going for another part of it to gut it. What really is chilling to me about that is if they overturn it, and if they get, again, these majority white districts where there's very little Black representation in particular, then whatever happens in Congress is technically legal. So they've hit it at the state level, who the states are sending to Congress. And then whatever laws they choose to pass or not pass, whatever policies they choose to enact or not, it's all legal. This is how the process is supposed to work. And then it's much, much harder then to claim, oh, well, you're breaking the law. Well, no, these are duly elected representatives. They're
Right.
voting in Congress. This is the way bills get passed into law. What are you complaining about? Well, what we're complaining about is the centuries of discrimination in this nation. And to me, fundamentally, the error is thinking that, uh, well, since we've seen progress, we no longer need the safeguards or the rules that led us to progress. We won. We did it. We're finished. We're done. So take away these rules. No, 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 no. And these are supposed to be Christians who have read Genesis 3 and the fall, right? They are just trusting people to do the right thing all the time, which, especially in politics, we know it's not going to happen. So it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, the other value I would just appeal to here is just simple fairness.
Mm,
That Christians, say they care about, right? And just like, yeah, treating each other with dignity and respect, like that thing. But it's also this principle of fairness. Like, why would we put ourselves, if you're truly Christian, why would you put yourself on the side of not arguing for fairness, right? That one person, one vote should be like not just an aphorism, but like something that is real and something has real power. And just back to Mississippi again. So the state, even today, Mississippi is about 40% African American. We have one black representative, one, because of gerrymandering in the state of Mississippi, right? And like there's no way that's justifiable when you kind of think about how that works, and you only get there through all kinds of nefarious, underhanded schemes, right? And why we can't just say like, look, as Christians, we're not for. Like gerrymandering is cheating, right? We're not for cheating, right? We're not for lying about whether this is really a representative government. That's not who we are. Like we should have more integrity than that. And I think kind of putting it that way, that gerrymandering is a lack of integrity, right? It's cheating, and that we really ought to be like against that, right? Not and not just kind of say, oh well, yeah, but it helps our side. And so there's our moral argument is it's okay because it helps us.
Yeah, I
on
think one of the, sort of things that you would hear in reply to that is that, well, you cheated first.
mhm.
You invented affirmative action. You set up these people who didn't deserve these things and put them in places of power. And so we have to cheat back in order to take away your capacity to cheat. And so really, I mean, I agree with you. And yet I'm hearing that other thing echoing in my mind is that there is this other narrative, where what we three might perceive as fair, certainly what Kristen would too. Now I will speak for her. What we would perceive as fair, they think we were cheating from the outset.
It is incredibly frustrating to me that that simple fairness, doesn't prevail. Although, if you look at the news feed and the headlines of far right, like it is an complete different universe.
Right.
For some reason, this stuff it's on my mind because for some reason this stuff started popping up on my Facebook feed, which I never even use Facebook. I just go there because it kind of automatically posts from Instagram, and sometimes I check, and I'm getting like these right wing news headlines and outlets, and it is the most bonkers stuff, which we can see because we have multiple sources as well as study and expertise and research. But if that's all you're seeing down this rabbit hole, and I mean, case in point is, did you hear about these leaked Telegram messages from the young Republicans?
Yeah, I'm glad you
Wow.
brought that up. Yeah.
So let me give a recap for folks. It's really disgusting stuff. This is from the original article from Politico. It says leaders of young Republican groups throughout the country worried what would happen if their Telegram chat ever got leaked, but they kept typing anyway. They referred to black people as monkeys and, quote, the watermelon people, and mused about putting their political opponents in gas chambers. They talked about sexually assaulting their enemies and driving them to suicide, and lauded Republicans who they believed supported slavery. And they said, quote, I love Hitler. So I knew immediately when it was the quote young Republicans club, people would misconstrue that to think these are like teenagers. These are people in their 20s and 30s. One is a state rep. These are not children. And they are saying the most vile things. And to that echo chamber piece, JD Vance gets on and minimizes it. It's just kids being kids. His version of, oh, it's just locker room talk. He's on there saying they shouldn't be canceled for, what they said in private messages and all of these things that are completely skirting the fact that this is hateful, dehumanizing speech coming from political operatives, whether elected or appointed or in administration, and it completely unbecoming of anyone who purports to uh, serve through government and politics. What did y'all see that? How did you react?
Mostly, I wanted to just wash their mouths out with soap. You know, it's it's like that's if I had talked like that when I was younger, well, and the few times that I did kind of go those directions, my mother sat me down in a chair and said, "No, young lady," you know, and literally I got my mouth washed out with soap. Now that might be
Mm,
considered torture today, but it was effective. And I just thought to myself, man, I wish my mom was around to sort of rattle a few of these cages, man. Who were the parents of these people? I mean, that was my main response is that I wanted to reparent them. Um,
mm,
and I just thought, how did we even get to a place where, I mean, I understand, people, I even understand the idea of potentially locker room talk. We all say things around private circles that we don't shouldn't have and we can be ashamed of. There's a big story about this right now in Virginia, where sadly enough, the Democratic candidate for Attorney General, there was a text that he sent. I guess it was in the wake of a school shooting. He was really upset at the fact that the state government in Virginia was seeming to reverse some of the gun laws that we had been putting in place. And there were never enough gun laws in Virginia anyway. And so he got really mad at one of the people in the legislature and said, "Well, I wish your kids would get killed and by guns." And so that text was released as part of the campaign that's going on right now in Virginia. And my sense is that he should come out and simply defend himself by saying, we all say really stupid things when we're angry. And I have always been really angry about the fact that this country and this Commonwealth in particular has no meaningful gun laws to stop this kind of thing. And so I, in a fit of rage, I turned that around on one of my colleagues from the opposite party and said things that I should not have said. Okay, fair enough. We have all had an experience like that. But this text string is not quite like that. This is not a sort of an isolated incident where these people were talking about something in relationship to a particular political issue or a particular thing they were mad about. This was like a string of the expression of stuff that they really thought at a deep level about other people. And when we start going back to, I think, what's becoming a main theme today, recognize the dignity and worth of every human being. Uh, there was no boundary in how much they were willing to demean people who were different or who disagreed with them. And
Yeah.
that's the kind of the difference in those two pools of bad behaviors. And I wish that we lived in a world where there could be clarity and around episodes like this.
I think the things that jumped out at me is kind of what you're saying, Diana. So, like, it's one thing if you say something in the heat of the moment, right? Even the law recognizes that we all kind of react in some ways in the heat of passion. There are ways to kind of recognize that human behavior. These texts took place over 7 months,
Right.
mm,
right? So these were not like in reaction to one hot thing and everybody had a quick hot take and went and it kind of led into a frenzy. These were sit back, go to bed, get up, like day after day for 7 months. It's a culture. And I think that's the thing we have to kind of take into account here is that this was not just a few one-offs. This was 7 months and it was across the country. It wasn't also just the Indiana young Republicans. I mean, this was across New York, Kansas, Arizona, Vermont. It was also not just it was none of them are in the South. These are kind of, like most of those are like blue state kind of places or purple state kind of kinds of places. And so that's what's happening here. And as you said, Jamar, these aren't high school kids. These are college and 20 something year olds as well. So they're adults with like a full head on their head. And the other thing that I think struck me about it is like when you read through the whole thing, and it is just chilling. It really turned my stomach. I mean, it is, like they're saying things, I'm ready to watch people burn now, was one of the comments, on here. And this the glee again, I keep coming back to that word. I'm going to write something at some point, but the glee at the violence, the glee at the using of the N word, calling lesbian and gay people demeaning slur words as well, like it's just full of this vile, putrid, racist, Nazi stuff here, and they're all just egging each other on. There's not anyone kind of going, "Hey, wait a minute." Like it just kind of rolls on, and maybe there's some people who were put off, but they were silent on the political reports. There wasn't anyone pushing back saying, "You know what? Like that's not appropriate. That's not okay, right? That's hateful. Like we shouldn't be doing that." Not a single person on this text chain, according to Politico, actually stepped in. And so, like, I think we often think, "Oh, well, uh, the sort of gerontocracy that's leading the parties, it's the older generation. It's Trump, and he's, really old. This is the next generation of the MAGA movement that we're talking about here. And then the last thing I'll say is this: can you imagine what Trump would be doing if this were the young Democrats?
Mm.
There'd be arrests if these were young. He calling them terrorists.
Yeah, he
I
called them
guarantee
Antifa.
you, that's what would be happening. And there's not been a blip that I've seen coming from Trump's mouth about this. No pullback. And the thing is that it's clear that they were kind of performing in many ways, and that Trump was giving them permission to do this. Some of them were talking about wanting to get endorsements from Trump on the group chat. So it's clear that sort of it is coming from the top. There's this kind of permission structure being generated by Trump, Elon Musk, Stephen Miller, all of it, right? And so at the same time, they're weaponizing anti-Semitism to go after universities and defending Israel, and not being willing to say anything about Gaza. At the same time they're doing that, they're providing cover for actual Nazi language, right? About loving Hitler and gas chambers and watching people burn. Like that's actually happening all at the same time. So like the hypocrisy, the double standard, it really made me just upset and incensed here that, yeah, not one word of pushback. I haven't seen it from anybody, not from Mike Johnson, not from Pete Hegseth, not from Trump, any of them saying, oh yeah, actually this is a problem.
And you're right. It's a culture. This is months and months and months. Bible says, out of the abundance of the heart, a person speaks. And so, and especially in private, like you tell them what you really think. And I do believe there's this thing about venting and catharsis, and I have group chats that that is not meant for public consumption. But at the same time, it is a moment of let me get this out of my system with trusted people who will also check me and call me on anything that is truly dehumanizing, or crosses the line. There was no sense of that here. It is part of the culture. And I think it gets to the fact that it wasn't the young Democrats, and who knows what they're saying, but if there was, there would be an outcry from Democrats. There would be some sort of consequences, or at least calls for
You
them,
sure
right?
hear it from us. I guarantee you'd hear it from us if that
Yes,
happened. Yeah.
exactly. So
I just told you a story about a
Yeah.
Democratic candidate who did something he really should not have done. And
and you're calling, yeah.
I'm not trying to hide that,
You wrote his apology speech for him.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, historically, though, this is what I say to people: there's always been a party of progress and a party of regress, and the party of regress typically typically makes racist, sexist appeals. Like that's their platform. That's what they run on. Right after the Civil War, there was a party ticket that said, "This is the white man's country. Let white men rule." And that never actually went away, no matter what the party label was, Republican or Democrat. What matters is the party platform. What matters is the appeal. So there's always a party that is appealing to more broad democratic participation, however unevenly, however imperfectly. And then there's always a party that says our winning strategy is to say, let's go back to the way things were when fewer people had a say, and mainly when wealthy white men had most of the power. And so that's what we're seeing to this day. Now, I'm not saying every single Republican is saying this or agrees with it, not by a long shot, but there's always a party to which these kinds of figures and this kinds of language is attracted and finds a home. And that ought to be cause for introspection, not deflection. So, as we wrap up, see, this is why we had to start with so many kind of signs of the positive, because we quickly descend into the state that we have been talking about. But we also want to end on a note of empowerment. So, as we record this, there's the No Kings, the next round of No Kings protests, and they're anticipating it'll be the biggest yet. And if we can end maybe on a note of practicality or something. Diana, I know you had some thoughts around this. How are you viewing the No Kings protests coming up this weekend, and what should people be aware of?
Oh, well, I actually, when we're recording this, the night before, I was on at a retreat doing a co-lecture with a Scottish writer, John Philip Newell. And we were talking about, believe this or not, this really does fit. We were talking about the medieval saint Julian of Norwich,
Mm,
who was a woman who wound up living her most of her adult life in a little room that was attached to a church in Norwich, England. And she was a hermit, essentially. And she wound up writing one of the first spiritual books in English written by a woman. And so her book is called The Showings of Divine Love. It is a very, very powerful book. And so I was thinking about how, and this came up in my lecture part, that Julian Norwich, she wasn't really, in effect, hiding away from the world, but she was looking for a vantage point to stand differently in the world. And she wound up living in this liminal space that was between the church and the world. And so she literally put her body into this space. And it was there she could look both directions and sort of function almost as a sort of spiritual mediator between the two worlds. And as I was talking about this and why this was had any kind of contemporary relevance at all, was I was thinking about nonviolent protest.
mm.
Because what nonviolent protest is essentially, and I really want to encourage people of faith who are trying to find the spirituality of it. I mean, it is, of course, I think inherently spiritual to stand up for justice, but you're also putting your body in a nonviolent way between an injustice and the potential for justice. And so you're literally entering into a liminal space, saying, I'm going to put my body between these two, what appear to be conflicting forces. And from this location, I'm going to witness both directions. I'm going to witness um, for justice, and I'm going to try to speak justice into an unjust situation. And it never really occurred to me that nonviolent protest really does function in this idea of creating a threshold where we put our bodies so that we can begin to enact the actual vision that we have theologically or spiritually for the beloved community, the kingdom of God, however you want to say that, even if it's literally just a better community.
Mm.
And so that's one of the things that I've been thinking about in relationship to protests. That we sometimes say you protest with your feet, or you're praying with your feet when you're protesting. Maybe simply the act of putting your body in the protest is also a form of prayer that we think about maybe a little less often. And it could have, I think, some appeal to people, particularly in more contemplative and Catholic traditions, to say, hey, yeah, I can do that. I can treat my body. I can put my body in a liminal space. And that's a meaningful act.
Well, that's two sips of the preferred beverage. I didn't have on my bingo card Fox News joining with other media outlets and refusing to bow the knee. And I didn't have on my bingo card Julian of Norwich connected to the No Kings protests, but
There you
that
go.
was a great one. Robbie, how about you?
Oh, I'm going to pull a thread from Diana's earlier comments. That was such a lovely image you gave us of the people deciding on the Nobel Peace Prize sitting in the room with the portraits around them. And it made me think of, this kind of Christian theological idea of this kind of great cloud of witnesses that we have around us. And sometimes when we're in tough spaces and we're in spaces where we don't know what to do, you can kind of, like Catholics have a much more robust theology of this, of kind of the communion of the saints and all this than Protestants do. But nonetheless, like the sense that there are those who have gone before us, right? That we can kind of gain some wisdom from. So I love that idea that them sitting in this room and this cloud of witnesses of the former Nobel laureates kind of calling to them and saying, like, what's the fit? What's the right fit here? And I think that that's one of the things that I think for people our age, right, who were barely born in the 60s or were children in the 60s and weren't old enough to participate in all the civil rights protests of the 60s, right? Man, this is our moment, and I think there's a way in which we can also think about um, standing with all those people we've admired that we read about in the history books, right? That we see those photographs of behind the microphone at the March on Washington and, in the Heschel and others, right? Yeah, you mentioned praying with your feet. All those images that we think of and people who have died and John Lewis and gone before, right? That there are that communion of the saints we can kind of draw some strength from, I think, and say, like, we're standing in that long line of justice. And Jamar, I'm just teeing this up for you, man. I see the spirit of justice over your shoulder there. But I am thinking about that there is this way in which we're not alone now, but we're not alone in history either, right?
Mm.
That we have this tradition that we can walk in.
I appreciate that, Robbie. And it reminds me of, we were talking about the Nobel Peace Prize, and of course, one of the winners of it was MLK, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. And it reminded me of his acceptance speech. And it's that speech in which he said, I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of thermonuclear destruction. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. And this is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. So let's let those words marinate in our spirit. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Convocation Unscripted. As always, we encourage you to subscribe, convocation.substack.com, as well as to our individual Substacks. We'll see you at the next Convocation.